Hello, everyone. My name's Dr. Jack Webb, and I don't think I've ever had such an enthusiastic lecture theatre, so it's lovely to welcome you all here. So I'm a lecturer in the history department. I specialise in Anglo-Caribbean history, so this is really looking at things like transatlantic slavery and also modern British history, and also the connections between the two of them, really. But our history department is vast. I think it's the biggest. Any of you knows it's the biggest in the country? At least it's in the top two, at least. And because of that, we have a huge range of specialisms. If you came to study here, you could do anything from the Vikings to medieval cities, all the way up to modern China, imperial China, and of course, modern British history as well. Can I ask you, who here is thinking of studying history at GCSE or A-level? Can you just put your hands up if you are? Well, that's a good number. It's a good number. It's not great, but it's good. I'd like everyone's hand to go up in response to that question, really. Because the history is important. It's not just important as an academic exercise. It's important for our society. How do we know who we are without history? We don't, essentially. Without understanding the constituent parts of how society works, the processes that got into it, think of the sense of discombobulation and confusion you'd have if you didn't know where you came from, if you didn't know why we were here, why things work this way. But also, and I think this is a really important point, it's not just about what we know, but also think how dangerous history could be in the wrong hands. If people were constructing identities and ideas about who we are in the wrong way to serve, say, political purposes or to serve ulterior agenda. So doing history the right way is really important. It's really crucial. And so having you all doing history makes society a much kind of better, enlightened, and kind of safer place. And this brings me on to the reason you're all here, really, which is our speaker today. This is the first time I've met Professor Olusoga, but I'm really grateful for his work. And that is because Professor Olusoga specialises in Black British history in particular. And you can't do British history without understanding Black history. You simply can't. The two are, in many senses, one and the same thing. So, for instance, the earliest example of the human remains that we have in Britain, the first person that we know to have existed in Britain, they're sort of 70–80% sure that there was a person who had what we'd now call a black skin. So if you go back to the dawn of time, you find a black presence in Britain. And as David's work has really kind of laid out, you go up through the medieval period, past the Roman period, into the Georgian period, for example, you find a black presence throughout British history. So David has, he's worked on a huge number of things. Can I ask, has anyone read any of David's books, seen any of his TV programs? Can you put your hand up if you've seen any of these? Okay, a good number again. They're brilliant. I use them in my teaching all the time. So I would urge everyone who hasn't seen any, please, go onto iPlayer or whatever else and have a look at them. So many, many awards have been attributed to his work from, let's see now, the latest one, A House Through Time, Two Cities at War. Many of you can see on iPlayer now, as I was watching it last night, in fact. But my personal favourite is Black and British, I think. And that's got both a book and a TV programme attached to it. But I could go on, going through all these kinds of books and these TV programmes that he's worked on. But without further ado, I think what I should just do is just hand over and let David speak for himself. So thank you, David.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Well, it is lovely to see so many of you here. And it's very good to see how many of you are studying history. I'm afraid I'm going to see it as my aim here to persuade those of you who aren't thinking of studying history to change your minds, because, as Dr. Webb said, it's the most important subject. But I wanted to begin, if I can, by sort of talking about how I got into history and the sort of journey that led me to becoming an historian. Give me 1 second. Right. So I was born in Nigeria, and I was brought up in the north of England, in the northeast. My mother is British. Her ancestors are Scottish, working class, rural workers, farmers. My father was Nigerian. And when I was growing up in the northeast of England, in the 70s and the 80s, long before you were born, Britain was a country that was obsessed with one particular historical event. And it was just absolutely everywhere. And it was the Second World War. Now, that you might think we're obsessed with the Second World War now, nothing compared to when I was a kid. This was a much more gendered world, and half the toys that boys played with, the boys were encouraged to play with, boys were advertised to, were toys to do with the Second World War. There was plastic soldiers and action figures, there was model aircraft. The films on television were old war films, black and white war films from the 1950s and the 1960s, which I loved. Every Christmas, all of these old war films were always on television at Christmas. There were even magazines that boys bought back then that were full of stories, adventure stories, of pilots and soldiers and sailors from the Second World War. And like all of my friends, I was just really fascinated by this enormous war that had affected the grandfathers of half my friends had fought in that war. It was everywhere. It was just part of British culture. And then one day, when I was about 14, my mother, who I said is white and British, said, "Do you know that Nigerians, people from Lagos, where you were born, men from your own ethnic group, the Yoruba from Nigeria, that they'd fought in the Second World War, and indeed they'd fought in the First World War? Did you know," she said, "that there is a war memorial in the center of Lagos, a city in Africa where I was born?" And that was the first time anybody had even suggested to me that the Second World War was more diverse, more inclusive, more global than the way it had been presented to me in those magazines, in those films, through those toys, and most importantly, in what I learned in my classroom. There was nothing in any of the ways in which the Second World War was presented to me as a child growing up in the 1980s that suggested that this was a war that involved Africans, or people from India, or Pakistan, or people from anywhere outside of Europe. Obviously, I knew the Japanese had been a combatant in the war. But in terms of other people from other parts of the world, there was no suggestion of that. I made a film for Google a couple of years ago. And as part of that, we went and bought the boxes of the toys that my generation played with, old antiques now, because I'm so old. The packaging, which usually doesn't survive. And on those toys of soldiers and action figures and action vehicles, every one of them, the images of the soldiers showed white European soldiers. And so that's inevitably, obviously, how I presumed the Second World War had been. I presumed it was exactly the way it was presented to me on television, in my classroom, in those toys. So my mother's intervention came as an absolute shock. And I have to admit, I almost didn't believe her, because it just didn't seem possible. Because as I said, that was not something anyone had ever said to me. Now, we lived opposite a library, and it took me quite a lot of reading and research to actually discover that my mother was white. My mother had told me something that was true, that this war was diverse. And when those books I read about the British Army of India, the biggest army, the biggest volunteer army of the war, the biggest army that Britain fielded, 2.5 million soldiers. There's actually a documentary on Channel 4, I think it's last week or this week, all about the soldiers from India who served in the British forces in the Second World War. And I discovered about the British West Indies Regiment, the black soldiers who'd fought in the First World War and in a different regiment, had fought in the Second World War. I discovered about around 1 million Africans who served in the Second World War in Africa, but also in Burma, fighting against the Japanese, and about the huge war during the First World War in Africa that had involved people from that continent, from all over Africa, from West Africa, Ghana, Nigeria, where my ancestors are from, but from East Africa, from Kenya, from elsewhere. And this totally different picture of the Second World War opened up to me. And what that made me realize was that the way that that history had been remembered in my classrooms, in the textbooks, and in the culture that had been built around that conflict, had edited out the involvement and the contributions of millions of people. And the strange thing about that was that when you looked back at the documents from the war, when you looked at the war films made during the war, the newsreels as well as the feature films, not the ones made afterwards, but the ones made during the conflict, when you looked at the posters that were made during the war, they didn't edit out the people from Africa and Asia and other parts of the empire. In fact, they celebrated the diversity of the war, and they celebrated the fact that this was a war that involved the whole British Empire. Because in that moment in 1940, when France, with an army of 5 million, had been knocked out of the war, France had surrendered, and Britain was in theory alone fighting against Germany, and as of June from Japan against Italy. At that moment, remembering that it wasn't Britain alone, but it was the British Empire, the biggest empire the world had ever known, that was of huge propaganda importance. There's a phrase that's used during wars, a phrase that's used in the army, morale. It means people feeling confident. And it was good for morale to remember it wasn't just Britain alone, it was the whole empire. There are two cartoons, and if I'd been more organized, I would have shown them on the screen, that were both published in British magazines in the summer of 1940. And one of them is remembered. One of them you will see in history textbooks, and the other one you won't. The famous one is by a guy called David Lowe, and it was published after Dunkirk. You all remember what happened at Dunkirk? We pretend it was a success, because again, that's a propaganda success. The Ministry of Information, very good at making a terrible defeat. The British Army being kicked off the continent, leaving half their material, their armoured cars, their tanks behind, but at least much of that army coming home to Britain to fight another day. But after Dunkirk, this terrible defeat, this desperate fear of standing alone against the might of Germany, that this war had not been a rerun of the First World War. The British and the French weren't together going to march on Berlin, but instead the Germans, and most importantly, the German Air Force, was just on the other side of the English Channel. In that moment, real fear, and a legitimate fear, historians argue about how legitimate, but a legitimate fear that there might even be an invasion of Britain. In that moment, remembering that the empire existed, that soldiers from all over the world would fight for Britain was really important, and yet the famous cartoon ignored that. The cartoon by David Lowe, it shows a soldier, and he's standing by the coast, like the English Channel, and over his head are flying German bombers coming to bomb British cities. And he's got his gun, his Lee Enfield rifle, and his fist in the air, and he says, "Very well, alone." And it's a brilliant symbol of defiance. Britain's lost its most important ally. The French army is much bigger than the British army. The war's not gone in any way the way anyone would have hoped in Britain. This is a moment of profound defeat and a diminution of British power, and yet the defiance was, we're alone, but we're going to fight on. It's a really powerful image, and again, you can see it in textbooks. The image that was just as popular, that appeared a few weeks later in a magazine called Punch by a cartoonist called Fugazi, again, it's set on the English Channel. But this time there were two soldiers. And one of them says, "So here we are, alone." And the other soldier says, "Yes, all 500 million of us." Now, the population of Britain is about 47 million. What he means by 500 million is the people of the British Empire. And that propaganda message, that it is not just the people of Britain, that we are not alone, but that we are part of a huge empire commonwealth, the biggest collection of people on earth. Remember, at the height of the British Empire, it controlled a quarter of the land surface of the world and around 23% of its people. That image that was really important, that was pushed by the Ministry of Information, the propaganda ministry during the Second World War, that image has been forgotten, and the idea of Britain alone is much more powerful. That is an idea that people still tap into, that Britain stood alone for all those years before America joined the war. That story, to believe that story, you have to forget about the empire. And again, the propaganda, the arguments put forward, the films that were made, the posters that were made during the war, says something completely different. One of the most famous posters in the war, produced again in 1940, shows soldiers from Britain, but also from South Africa, from New Zealand, from Canada, and from Australia, soldiers from India and soldiers from Africa. And they're in that order, with the Africans at the back, the Indians in the second row, and the white soldiers in the first two rows. It shows a racial hierarchy of empire, but underneath it says together. Again, the image of the empire is together. So during the war, the image that people had of the diversity of the conflict was completely different to the image that was presented to me as a child in the 1980s. 30, 35 years later, all of those people, all of those countries, all of those contributions somehow had gone missing, somehow wasn't part of how we remembered the war. People who had lived during the war, particularly in Bristol where I live, would have seen people from all over the world coming to Britain to take part in the war, as well as soldiers from the Caribbean, from India, from other parts of the empire. They would have seen 150,000 African Americans. There was even a riot in Bristol, in the centre of Bristol, the city I live in, where the white military police of the American army fought a battle against black soldiers. Black population in Britain was bigger in 1944 than it was in 1954 because of this 150,000 African American soldiers. So the diversity of the war was obvious to anyone who'd lived through it. It was obvious if you go back and look at the documents, the propaganda, the films, and yet by the 80s, it had all gone missing. And that realization that I had when I was 14, when my mother confronted me and said, the version of the war in your textbooks, in your toys, in the films you're watching on television, does not tell everyone's story. That revelation has sort of in some ways been the kind of key moment in my career as an historian, because I've spent the rest of my life basically trying to paint back in the stories of all of those individuals, all of those communities, all of those contributions, and to try to tell the stories that we have decided not to tell. I wrote a book a few years ago about the First World War. Just as imperial, arguably more imperial, just as diverse as the Second World War. The first shot fired by a soldier of the British forces in the First World War was not fired by a white soldier, and it wasn't fired in France or Belgium, where the Western Front was later to develop. It was fired in Cameroon by an African, by a Muslim African, a man called Al-Haji Grunchi, who was a member of the West African Frontier Force. And he was part of an army that had invaded the German colony of Cameroon. The very first shot, fired on a Lee Enfield rifle by a soldier in the British forces, fired by a black African, a Muslim soldier in the First World War. The image we have of the Western Front, I was obsessed with both wars, I should say, when I was growing up. The image we have of the Western Front, the images you will have seen when you've studied the First World War, a war that's we better remember through a dozen white poets than we do through the hundreds of thousands of non-white people who took part in that war. The image we have of that conflict is again different to the image that people who lived through it would have remembered. There were newspaper reports of journeys taken by British journalists and American journalists and French journalists through the area behind the line in 1914, 15, 1916, once the Western Front had solidified. Because behind the line was arguably the most diverse place that had ever existed in all of history. Because all of the colonial armies, the British Army mobilized the empire, many of those armies were diverse. Not just that, by 1917 there was an American army that included African Americans, included Native Americans. The Australian army included soldiers from the Aboriginal communities. The New Zealand forces, the Anzac forces, included soldiers who were Maori. The Canadian forces included Indigenous Canadians. The South African forces included the South African Native Labour Corps. A few weeks ago, I was in a place called Medicine Hat, Alberta. I'd never heard of it until a few years ago either. It is in the middle of nowhere. We flew to Calgary. We drove in a straight line for 250 miles, and then we turned right. The scale of Canada always astonishes me. We went to Medicine Hat, Alberta, because in a museum, well, the only museum, it's a tiny town, is an object called the Great War Deeds of Mike Mountain Horse. It is a painted calf hide. So it's a piece of leather, the shape of a calf. And it was produced in 1931 by two men, Mike Mountain Horse and his friend, Chief Ambrose. And what it is Mike Mountain Horse was a member of the Kainai Blood Indians, an indigenous people from the Great Plains of North America. And the border between America and Canada runs right through the vast territories that for hundreds of years were their hunting grounds. And in 1915, his brother Albert was killed on the Western Front. These are indigenous Canadians. They were recruited by the missionaries in the reserves of the Blackfoot area, areas of Canada. His brother was killed on the Western Front, and Mike Mountain Horse joined the British Army, the Canadian Army, and fought on the Western Front. And when he got back from the war, in the traditions of his people, he did this. It's quite a beautiful tradition. It's part therapy, like going to see a psychologist or psychiatrist, and it's part history. He described his images of what his worst, most powerful memories of being on the Western Front were, and they were painted as pictures onto the calf hide by Ambrose Two Chiefs. So this is the memories of a man who was born and lived 6,000 miles away from the Western Front in the middle of the Great Plains of Canada. This is his memory of taking part in the Battle of Arras, in the Battle of Cambrai, in stories and events about the First World War I was taught again about at school. Nobody never suggested, my textbooks had nothing to say about the fact that soldiers from India, soldiers from Canada, soldiers from Australia, the Maori people from New Zealand had also taken part in that battle. And here, 6,000 miles away, is a depiction of his involvement, his role in the Western Front. And in order to go and see this, we had to approach his descendants. We had to ask them if we could see this sacred object, which is also a history of what he'd been through. Because for centuries, Kainai Blood Indians who'd been at war have painted their war deeds. They go back to the wars over horses and muskets in the 18th and 19th centuries. The most recent was painted by a Kainai Blood Indian who served in the American Army in Afghanistan just a few years ago. They're all together in this museum, preserved for this people. And we had to go through a ceremony. We had to smoke a pipe. We had to have ochre and buffalo tallow painted on our face in order to come near this sacred object, because it means so much to these people. But what meant just as much to them was that a bunch of people from England had got on a plane, traveled 6,000 miles, to want to tell the story of how their ancestors were in the First World War. They were delighted to be seen, to be recognized, to be part of a history from which they had been written out like so many other people. So that moment when my mother shocked me into realizing that the First and Second World Wars were not the way I was taught. As I said, it's been a pivotal moment in my life. It's shaped the history that I do, because I think it's human nature. If you discover you're not being told something, that there's something people don't want you to know, I think human nature means you want to know the thing people don't want you to know more than you want to know anything else. If I gave you a book and you saw I cut out one of the chapters, you might be interested in the rest of the book, but you'd be more interested in the chapter I didn't want you to see. So that desire to fill in those missing chapters, that's shaped a lot of the work that I do. But the other thing that I've been interested in trying to do is to understand how. How was it possible that all of those people, all of those stories, all of those contributions, how were they edited out of the history? What was the mechanism? How do you go about fighting a war that involves hundreds of thousands of people from all over the world and then editing them out? How was it possible that when the Second World War ended in 1945, the image that everyone understood was of an imperial conflict, and how was it by, say, 1985, when I was a teenager, they'd all been erased, they'd all been airbrushed out? Well, you can see those moments of erasure, as well as the moments of amnesia, because it's not all erasure, some of it's just forgetfulness. You can sometimes come across them, and you can see how it was done. Let me give you, I think, one of the most telling examples. In the National Archives, a place those of you who want to do history will become familiar with, and you become familiar with how bad its cafe is in the years to come. You've all got that to look forward to. In the National Archives, there is a box, well, there are millions of boxes, but there's a box that is the correspondence between the British, the Americans, and the French, the military forces of those three countries, and they are discussing the stage managing of a critical event in world history. This was one of those events that the participants could stage manage. They wanted to work out how they were going to manage this historic event, and they were absolutely right. This was an event that they all appreciated was going to be stamped onto the memory of the world forever. It was an event that would be photographed. There would be the news cameras of all over the world there to record it. It was a moment when history could be managed. The event was the liberation of Paris. This was 1944, and the first letters are early in 1944, writing between the British, the Americans, and the French. How were they going to manage this key moment, which was what would happen when the Allied forces, after they'd landed at D-Day in Normandy, fought their way through France, what would happen when they got to Paris? Remember, we talked about Dunkirk a moment ago. The fall of France in 1940, the capture of the French capital, those images of Hitler at the Trocadero looking over at the Eiffel Tower, the soldier from the First World War who had dreamed, as Hitler had, of getting to Paris, finally, 1940, reaching the French capital. The symbolic moment of the recapture, the liberation of Paris, was going to be a defining moment of the 20th century, and the British and the Americans and the French knew it, and they got to work planning it. The first thing they all agreed on was something which is actually quite beautiful. They instantly appreciated that the symbolism of this moment meant that it was absolutely vital, that the army that marched through the streets of Paris, that drove their trucks and their jeeps down the Champs-Élysées through l'Arc de Triomphe, that army had to be French soldiers. And there was a French army, the Free French Forces. They fought through the Second World War. Not all of the French army had been captured in 1940 with the fall of France, and some of the soldiers taken to Britain in Dunkirk were French soldiers, and also other French soldiers from other parts of the French Empire had been recruited. So France had an army. It was trained in Britain. It had bases up in Scotland, and it had fought in North Africa. It had fought since D-Day. And the role of the Free French Forces in this symbolic moment, the liberation of Paris, everyone understood, Britain, America, and France, that this was the right thing to do. It sent out a really powerful message about a country liberating its own capital. But the British and the Americans had another stipulation, another demand that they insisted the French agree to. And it's very often when documents are dealing with issues around race, they don't use simple words. They hide their meaning behind code words, code phrases. The British and the Americans insisted that the French army that liberate Paris had to be made up of soldiers that they called Metropolitan French. Can you guess what that means? It's French, but a very specific form of French. They mean white people. Yeah, white French. The problem was the Free French Army was around 2/3 not white. The army that France had fought with from 1940 onwards, much of it had been recruited in the French colonial empire. It was soldiers from West Africa and North Africa, as well as white French, metropolitan French, as the British and Americans like to call them. The majority of the Free French Army were not white. 17,000 West Africans, the tirailleurs sénégalais, had died fighting for France in the Second World War. Some of the first war crimes of the Second World War were the massacres of black French soldiers, the tirailleurs sénégalais, by the Germans in the north of France in 1940. And this was revenge for for black French soldiers having fought on the Western Front in the First World War and taken part in the occupation of part of Germany, the Rhinelands, in the early 1920s and 1919. Terrible war crimes committed against these black soldiers. 17,000 had died in those war crimes in the battles afterwards. And yet, the British and the Americans, in this documentation that you could go and read in the National Archives, they were not to be allowed to take part in the liberation of Paris. Neither were the North African soldiers. Again, France had colonies in North Africa, of course, Algeria. Soldiers from Algeria were not to be allowed to take part in the liberation of Paris. And again, soldiers from Algeria had fought on the Western Front for France and in the Middle East, in Gallipoli, in the First World War. And so, after D-Day, as the French forces, alongside the British, the Americans, the Canadians, fought their way through France, the black soldiers and the North African soldiers were slowly taken out of their regiments, week by week. And a new regiment that didn't really exist, made up of just the white soldiers from all of those units, was slowly gathered together. The French actually couldn't find enough white soldiers, because this army was overwhelmingly not white, to take part in the liberation of Paris. So they went to the camps of the North African soldiers and they tried to work out which of them looked just about white enough that no one would notice in the photographs and the newsreels. And if you go on YouTube now and you type in the liberation of Paris and you look at the photographs, you look at the newsreel films, what you see is the image of the Free French forces that the British and the Americans insisted was imprinted into the historical record. You would look at those images of white soldiers in Willys Jeeps and GM trucks, driving through Paris with people throwing flowers, with women hugging these soldiers. You would think that must be what the Free French forces were like. Must have been a white army. Now think about what the opportunity was there that was lost. That was a moment in which the reality of what the Second World War looked like, the reality of who the French forces were in the Second World War, could have been not just broadcast to the world in 1945, it could have been stamped onto the historical record. It would have been much more difficult for me as a child in the 80s to be given an image of the Second World War that didn't include non-white people, if those had been the images in the documentaries I'd watched, in the books that I had at school, the books in the library opposite my house. But that prospect of it being recognized that the Free French forces were predominantly not white, that prospect of it being recorded that black African soldiers symbolically liberating a white European capital, that was something that so repelled the Americans and the British that they did everything. They conspired for a year to make sure that didn't happen. Huge amounts of effort and expense and bureaucracy in creating a false picture to disguise the real picture of the role, and in this case, the deaths of thousands of Africans, North African, West African soldiers in the Second World War. It's not just the effect of the erasure that's important, it's also important to remember how it was done. Events like that. And that event is not unique. At the end of the First World War, again, a global conflict, again, an imperial conflict that involved soldiers from across the British Empire, but also across the French Empire. A war that was again fought in Africa and in the Middle and in the Far East. At the end of that war, there were two so-called peace parades. There were victory parades, to give them a typology. The one in London included soldiers from all over the empire, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and India. But the British, as again, documents at the National Archives will tell you, decided not to bring the West Indian soldiers and to not allow soldiers from Africa, even though 1 million Africans had fought as soldiers and carriers, labourers, in the war in Africa. Not to bring them to London for the peace parade. The British said that they couldn't afford the shipping of transporting the West African regiments to London. And in the peace parade in Paris, the American authorities refused to allow the 369th Infantry Regiment to march down the Champs-Élysées, to take part in those in that peace parade. That was because the 369th were an entirely black regiment. They were called the Harlem Hellfighters. They were actually arguably the most militarily effective and one of the most highly decorated. They won the most medals of all the units in the American army, even though they actually had to fight in French uniforms with French rifles and French helmets, because white American officers wouldn't lead black soldiers into conflict. All of that was erased by those peace parades. Again, there was an event that could have shown the diversity of the armies that fought in the First World War, and again, the authorities insisted that those people and their contributions and their stories would be erased. The war's only been over for a few months, and already the process of airbrushing those people out of the story, that had already begun. And again, so a bit like the Second World War, I remember one of my textbooks, when I was doing A-level history, told me about the first British attack on the Western Front. The British had obviously been on the defensive for most of the war. March 1915, the first British attack, the Battle of Neuve-Chapelle. My textbook, and I bought these textbooks, I found them online a few years ago, just to prove to myself that these erasures were as I remember. It says, the first battle was fought by the British Army with support from the Indians. And then you go to the documents, or you go to the official history that the army wrote of that conflict, and you see most of the soldiers who took part in that attack were Indians. The Indians weren't supporting, the Indians were the majority of the attacking force. Indeed, a quarter of the British soldiers on the Western Front by the end of 1914 were Indian. Within weeks of the outbreak of the war, Britain had decided to mobilise the 140,000 easily transportable troops of the British Indian Army, an army bigger than the British Army, the British Expeditionary Force. Within a couple of weeks, they were at the Suez Canal. Within 6 weeks, they were at Marseille. By October, they were marching up to what was to become the Western Front. In the very first pictures of the British fighting on the Western Front, you can see Indian soldiers, Sikhs, Muslims, Hindus, in their uniforms, in their tropical uniforms. There's pictures of them marching through Marseille being celebrated. The front of Le Figaro, the French newspaper, says, "Hooray for the Hindus," the arrival of the Indians in British India. Again, all of this forgotten, all of this erased. So I'm one of those historians, and there's quite a lot of historians who spend their life trying to recover the significance, the contributions of people, of events, of communities in British history. And as a result of that, as was said a moment ago, we're beginning to recalibrate what are the boundaries of British history. As was said a moment ago, black history is British history. Imperial history is British history. The relationship between this country and India is British history. And yet the version that I walked away with when I was studying at school, right until I got to university, edited all of this out. It's really exciting to be involved in the history of empire, to be involved in the history of slavery and black history, because it's a growing area of history. It's an expanding field of history, because we're discovering more and more. We're discovering connections every day. We're discovering new people every day. This is an area of history where we're not raking over the same old documents for new interpretations. We're almost drowning in the scale of research. In 2026, a new piece of research is going to be published by the University of Lancaster into Britain's slave traders. They've looked at the backgrounds of almost 10,000 individuals, and I think it's 3,000 organizations, institutions, schools, universities, charities, to show connections that they'd forgotten with Britain and the slave trade. There's new databases emerging all the time that allows you to put in where you live, put in your family name, put in the city that you want to go to university, put in an institution and see what its connections was to empire and to slavery. This is an area of history that is growing, by the day. And as a result, we keep discovering amazing new people. I mean, I said I was going to try to persuade some of you to do history. I guess the main argument I'd use is you can meet remarkable people who we just lost track of. About 10 years ago, a bunch of historians started trying to research into a woman called Sarah Forbes Bonetta. And part of that research was we traced her family, her descendants. Sarah Forbes Bonetta was from the same ethnic group as me. She was a Yoruba from Nigeria. But in the 1850s, she was captured in a war and she was made a slave. She was enslaved by King Gezo, one of the worst of the slave-trading kings of West Africa, King of Dahomey. And in the 1850s, Sarah was given as a gift, as a present, by King Gezo to Captain Forbes to give to Queen Victoria. This child, she was about 6, she was given as a gift. She was given her name. She was taken back to Britain by Captain Forbes, given the name Forbes after his name and Bonetta after the ship she sailed on, the HMS Bonetta. And when she got to Britain, she was taken eventually to see Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria paid for her upbringing, paid for her education. She was sent first to Sierra Leone, and she came back. She lived in Brighton. She got married in 1861 to a Nigerian businessman, another person from Lagos, the city I was born in. Her wedding in Brighton was an international event. There are hundreds of newspaper reports and syndicated reports in newspapers all over the world. It was a big issue in America, which was in the middle of the Civil War. And this marriage between a wealthy, privileged Black Briton and a wealthy and privileged Nigerian subject of the British Empire, a wedding that had been approved by Queen Victoria to a woman who was effectively the ward of Queen Victoria, someone she was cared for by the Queen, was global news. And when Sarah had a daughter, her daughter was called Victoria Davies, that child became the goddaughter of Queen Victoria. When Sarah died, Victoria Davies had her education paid for. She was sent to a very posh school, Cheltenham Ladies' College, and she was given a pension and given gifts by Queen Victoria. Not only had historians forgotten about this incredible story, the family were in the process of forgetting the story. So when historians contacted this family and said, "We've been researching your ancestor," what they discovered was that the older people in this family had been saying to the younger people, "Do you know your great-grandmother was the goddaughter of Queen Victoria?" And the younger people have been saying, "Yeah, of course she was, Grandma. Yeah." The younger people have been not believing. It sounded so impossible, so unlikely, so implausible that they had not believed the older people in the family, something which was true and verifiable, photographs to prove it. In the photographic collections of Camille Sylvie, the great society photographer, the photographer of the rich of the middle of the 19th century, there you turn a page and is this black couple. Not only had the country forgotten, not only was she not in books about the 19th century, she wasn't in books about Queen Victoria, even though she appears in Queen Victoria's diary on 6 occasions, her own family had begun to forget. As well as erasure, there's also amnesia. But this is a world of history that is kind of bursting out. Let me tell you about another person who we didn't know about a few years ago. There's a guy called William Darby, born in Norwich. Both his parents were from the Caribbean. He was a Black Briton, Black Victorian. His dream was to be a circus performer. And William Darby is not going to work as a stage name in the Victorian circus, so he changed his name to a much better stage name. He called himself Pablo Franchi. And he became just about the most successful Victorian circus performer. He performed on horseback. He did acrobatics on horses, incredibly dangerous stuff. His son was a trapeze artist. Remember, there's no nets, there's no safety. this is really, really dangerous stuff. And this was incredibly celebrated. There's dozens of newspaper reports with pictures of Pablo Fanqui jumping over horses, jumping off horsebacks. They performed for Queen Victoria. Also, he was so successful, he made so much money, that he wasn't just a performer, he owned his circus. It was called Pablo Fanqui's Fair. And when they arrived in a town, they would get off the trains and the stations, they would march with their bands through the town, set up their big tent in the local park, make a huge spectacle and draw crowds in. Incredibly successful business. And what he did was, because he made so much money, was he organized special performances that were called benefit performances. And the idea there was that if you were a circus performer and you were retiring, because maybe you were a bit old to jump over horses or breathe fire or tame lions or whatever it was you were doing, and you didn't fancy your chances of keeping doing that as you got older, this benefit performance, would all the money from the performance, all the money that the audience gave, that would go into a pot that would be given to that one circus performer to allow them to go and do something else, to retrain or to open a pub or open a cafe or do whatever they were going to do. These benefit performances were one of the things he was famous for. Now, this famous Victorian, famous black Victorian Pablo Fanqui had an astonishing life. It gets even more astonishing after his death. And he gets even more British after his death in a strange way, because in 1968, 90 years after he died, a poster for one of those benefit performances was in an antique shop in a place called Sevenoaks in Kent in the south. And one day, someone came into the shop and bought that poster. The person who bought that poster was John Lennon. He was in Sevenoaks in Kent because the Beatles were performing, they were filming one of their weird videos up on the common there. And because John Lennon was a genius, he took that poster and word for word, he made 2 changes, created a song using the words of that poster. The song is called For the Benefit of Mr. Kite. And it's on what many people believe is the greatest album of all time. You might disagree. Maybe you should go and listen to it. I'd love you to go and listen to this song tonight. Being For the Benefit of Mr. Kite on Sgt. Pepper, the Beatles album, is word for word the poster for Pablo Fanqui's Fair in the 1860s, a benefit performance for a circus performer called Mr. Kite. This is a black Victorian who wasn't in textbooks when I was growing up, who we had forgotten about, who wasn't even in books on black British history back in the 80s. It wasn't until this century that his story was recovered, that his grave was unearthed and repaired. A man who performed for Queen Victoria, a man whose name is in a Beatles song, and yet totally forgotten. Historians had somehow let him fall between the cracks. This is what I mean by this being an expanding area of history. We're knowing more each year. We're discovering new people each year. And yet, so much of my career as an historian has been about slowly recognizing that this history is right in front of you. We've learnt almost, we've been schooled not to see it. In the center of our capital city, in Trafalgar Square, is Nelson's Column. You've all probably been to Trafalgar Square, you've seen Nelson's Column. In one of those, at the base of it, are 4 bas-reliefs. They're made of metal. They're made of melted French cannons from the Battle of Trafalgar. And in one of them is an image of a black sailor, right in the center of London, a black Georgian, a depiction of men who lived in Britain in the early years of the 19th century and who fought in the Battle of Trafalgar, unnoticed. We walk past it, we don't notice this black image, and yet I still encounter people who think black British history doesn't really start until the 20th century, until the Windrush in 1948. And yet right in the centre of our capital city is a depiction of a black Georgian. In Parliament, a few hundred metres away, in the Royal Robing Room, is a picture of, very expensive picture, very celebrated picture of the Battle of Trafalgar, and again, there's a black sailor. When I was taught the Battle of Trafalgar at school, again, no idea that the British Navy the Royal Navy of 1805 was a diverse navy. And yet, again, in the National Archives, a place I'm urging you to go, as you can tell, there's the muster lists, the ship lists for the ships that fought under Nelson in Trafalgar, the greatest naval victory, arguably, in British history. 123 men born in the Caribbean, 18 men born in Africa. We can see their names. We can see the way in which they are interconnected in British history. When I went to university, and I chose my university so I could study slavery. In those days, there were fewer options of where you could go to study slavery. And I began to understand the significance of Britain's relationship with the Caribbean. Just how central, first the transatlantic slave trade and then second plantation slavery, had been to the evolution of the English and then the British Empire. I began to realize the scale of this enormous phenomenon, maybe 10, 11% of the British economy, all of those value chains added together by the beginning of the 19th century. I began to see the ways in which it was right in front of me, and yet I didn't notice it. When I was growing up, my favourite sweets were called Highland Toffees. And they were made by a Scottish company called McGowan's. They're still made by a Scottish company called McGowan's. Highland Toffee, they had tartan wrappers. My ancestors on my mother's side are Scottish, and me and my sisters and my brother, we used to go to Scotland for holidays to see family. And we loved going to Scotland, not just to see family, we loved because we got loads of sweets from our relatives. Because Scotland then, and Scotland now, is famous for the sweet tooth. It was famous for iron brew and Scottish shortbread, sugary things. But why is Scotland famous for sugary things? Why is there so much sugar in the Scottish diet? Well, Scotland was arguably overrepresented in involvement in sugar slavery in the British Caribbean. There's lots of statistics and lots of debate about those statistics, but one of the clauses, clause 4 of the Act of Union that brought England and Wales and Scotland together was that the Scots would have access to what were called the English plantations, that they could take part in what was then the English Empire. And the Scots threw themselves into the slave trade and into slavery. When you think about some of the names of people from the island of Jamaica, they're Scottish names, because in the British Empire, as in other empires, enslaved people, though not all empires, enslaved people were given the names of the families who claimed to own those enslaved people. My favourite music, as well as my favourite sweets, was connected to this history. My favourite music was by the Wailers, the band that became Bob Marley and the Wailers. There were 3 key members, founding members of that band. Bob Marley. Marley is a Scottish name, and Bob Marley was mixed race. He was half Scottish. His father was a Scottish soldier. The other, Bunny Livingston and Peter McIntosh. McIntosh, Livingston, and Marley. 3 almost stereotypical Scottish names from 3 black and mixed race guys from the island of Jamaica. That's a reflection of the history of slavery that was right in front of me, in the sweets that I ate and the music that I listened to, and yet it was invisible in the lessons I learned at school. And so, to wrap up, because I'm coming to the end of my time, the reason I'd urge you to think about history as a subject is because it is, as was said earlier, it's vitally important. We're on a journey as a country, I think, to try to better understand who we are, to better understand moments from our history that have been misrepresented. Last week, there was an appeal by charities that we should teach a version of the Second and First World Wars in schools that includes the African, the Indian, the West Indian soldiers who fought. We should undo the erasure that was complete by the time I was growing up. History, as you will have noticed, is often front-page news. The statues in our cities, they're being rethought through. Some of them have been toppled. The statue of Edward Colston, the slave trader in the city I live in, Bristol, knocked down 4 years ago, dragged through the streets, thrown in the river. History is emerging, it's erupting into the modern world, because what we're engaged in as a country, and other countries are in similar journeys, is trying to find a version of our national story that better reflects who we are, that better reflects the diversity that we can see in this room. Because the histories that we've often edited out are the histories that explain how we all came to be here on these cold islands together. Because these histories are, for me, for many people in this room, family histories. Thank you very much.
So it's not about it's history, but did they used to call Britain perfidious Albion?
God, I can't remember where that phrase comes from. I mean,
Deceitful Britain.
I wish we were more perfidious. The idea that what that phrase means is that Britain was a country that couldn't be trusted, that the British were too slippery. Any deal or any treaty you might agree with the British, that they'd find a way out of it. I think some of the decisions we made as a country recently makes me look backwards with a bit of nostalgia for the days when people thought we were so professional and so clever that we couldn't be trusted in negotiations. I look forward to the days when we're called perfidious Albion again, to be honest. Any more questions?
How can we tell the reliability of the media we consume now if in the past it was filled with bias?
Well, I mean, there's always been bias. I mean, to look at the news media, I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, to take the newspapers of the Second World War. They are reporting on the diversity of the war effort because it has a propaganda purpose. It helps people who've just had a catastrophic defeat like Dunkirk to feel that they're not alone in the world, to remind them that the resources and the manpower of this vast empire are there to support them. But the same newspapers were, equally engaged in disguising elements of this history that didn't fit the government's purpose or didn't fit their owners' remit. I mean, some of the issues around segregation by the American army in Britain during the Second World War, some of that goes unreported. Some of that is reported in newspapers. Some of it, for propaganda reasons, for morale reasons, is not reported. Britain's newspapers and Britain's government didn't really want to create tension between the Americans, who of course had entered the war and who were Britain's key ally, who were funding Britain's war effort, didn't want to embarrass them by pointing out or by complaining about the ways in which they had a segregated army, the way in which African American soldiers were treated. So while it was in the interest at times of those newspapers to say, look, remember, there's an army of India of 2.5 million. Here's the soldiers, the airmen from the Caribbean who've come to help get our bombers over Germany. At the same time, there were other elements of this history that were not reported. So newspapers then and newspapers now have always got to be seen the way all historical sources are, with a certain degree of skepticism. You've always got to look what is being said, what's not being said, who is the person saying it, who is the person paying for it to be said. Remember, the owner of a newspaper is as important as the journalist. And what is the context in which it's being said? What is the background? So all historical sources, modern newspapers and historic newspapers, like all other sources, have to be treated with a certain amount of skepticism. But what's useful to historians is newspapers, very often things are reported that are later forgotten because, for that reason, the conditions, the reasons for reporting it. So those people who would like to forget that there were non-white soldiers who wanted to present a white version of the Second World War, they hope that we just forget and not bother to look at the newspapers and the newsreels that celebrated the imperial contribution. So even though their motivations are not always pure, very often the reportage and the record still allows us to better interpret what things were happening and to understand the motivations for those reports and for those absences, if that makes sense.
What do you find most fascinating about the slave trade?
Well, sometimes people will say in Britain today that we talk too much about slavery and the slave trade. And I think what that speaks to is the fact that we've only just begun to talk about it. This is the beginning of the conversation because those histories were very effectively airbrushed out. We didn't really want to talk about them. We didn't want to discuss them because it's uncomfortable. It's really ugly. It's a horrible thing. And very often what we want from history is history to tell us that we're exceptional people, that to focus on the achievements, the victories, the inventions, the heroes, and not something that was really tragic, really brutal. So I think we're actually only beginning to discuss this. And when people say to me, we talk about it too much, I always ask them the same questions. I mean, how many of us can name a slave ship? Now, you might have heard of the Zong, which is famous. You might have heard of the Amistad. But they're famous in the latter case because there was a rebellion on board, a successful rebellion. And the Zong was famous because of a terrible massacre, because of a court case in London. But there were thousands of slave ships. 2,114 slave ships left Bristol, where I live, from the 1680s to 1807. 2,114. I have never done a talk in Bristol and asked people to name one of those 2,114 and they could manage. Because we don't know. We're only at the beginning of this conversation. The same could be said about plantations. There were thousands of plantations. How many of us could name a slave plantation? How many of us could name a slave owner? Not someone famous who was something else, who was also a slave owner, like the Gladstones, who were also later Prime Minister, John Ewart Gladstone. But how many of us could name a slave owner? Or a slave trader? We can't, because we're right at the beginning of this conversation. So I think what's interesting about it is this is a history that for lots of different reasons was not something that was part of what was taught, what was discussed, what was acknowledged as being part of British history. And now it is emerging into our conversations. And in some ways, I guess the other thing which is significant is that it's not just emerging into the way we think about our history and the way we think about our country here in the UK. If you go to Barbados or to Jamaica and you talk to people your age in those countries, they are very, very aware that their ancestors were enslaved, that their ancestors were carried into slavery predominantly, overwhelmingly, on British slave ships. They're very, very well aware that it was British kings and queens, the Stuart kings, Charles II, James II, who initiated the English slave trade. Even Elizabeth I was involved in 3 slave trading expeditions. They're very aware that the Georgian kings, George I, II, and III, were defenders and investors in the British slave trade. They're very, very well aware that the connections between their island, the reason why they speak English, the reason why they're culturally very British is because these were islands controlled by Britain. In the case of Jamaica from 1625 onwards, from the case of Jamaica from 1655 onwards. This history is emerging not just in Britain, it's emerging in the Caribbean. You might remember 3 years ago, Prince William and Princess Kate went on a tour of the Caribbean, and it was really regarded as a PR disaster, public relations disaster, because there were demonstrations all the time, because there were demands that they acknowledge Britain's role in the slave trade, because there were demands that they pay reparations for Britain's role in the slave trade. Last week, the Commonwealth Summit in Samoa was dominated by the nations of the Caribbean requesting that Britain begin a dialogue to pay reparations, to pay compensation for slavery. This history, as I said, of this broader history, it's front page news. It's one of those areas of history that you can't really get away from, because it's a history that has been pushed to the back, delayed, ignored for such a long time. Its time has come. The King himself said, the time for this conversation has arrived, and it's bursting into the 21st century. And it's your generation who are going to be dealing with these conversations, because people in the Caribbean are not going to forget about this history. They're not going to, as David Cameron, our former Prime Minister, said, move on from this history. They're not, as our current Prime Minister said, going to only look at the future. They are going to keep talking about this history, and they're going to keep talking about the issue of reparations. So what's interesting about it is it does, I think the first thing that was said earlier is it's about now. History is not just about the past. History is about today. And this is a living, breathing, contested, and very active arena of history. Thanks for your question. Can we have some quiet for this question, please?
Where in the world did the slave trade affect the most, and how did it affect it?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, obviously, the Atlantic slave trade is triangular. That means ships leave Britain, and they leave Britain with goods, with things they're going to trade on the coast of Africa for enslaved people. So The first journey in that triangle affects Britain, because all sorts of industries and trades develop in Britain to produce, to build those ships, to produce the goods, cloth, glass, guns, to be sent to Africa. So it impacts on Britain. There's wealth to be made, there's industries to develop. And it's not just in the slave trading ports like Liverpool and Bristol and London and Glasgow. It's also miles away from those ports. I was brought up in the northeast. In Gateshead, the town I was brought up in, there was an iron manufacturer who produced chains to tie people, to bind them to the decks of slave ships. So a huge amount of money is made in Britain through the production of those goods and through the profits that come through the purchase of enslaved people and through the production of the goods that they produce. So it affects Britain enormously. Thousands of buildings, thousands of institutions, thousands of families, all acquiring wealth through the transatlantic slave trade. Then it affects Africa, because Africa had slavery before the Europeans arrived, and Europe had slavery before the Atlantic slave trade. The enslaved people tended to be prisoners of war, people who'd been caught, captured in war, who were then enslaved in their societies. Very different forms of slavery, various different types of slavery. And that form of slavery moved into the transatlantic slave trade. And that led to an impetus for there to be more wars, to produce more enslaved people. The fact that people who lost wars could be enslaved, the fact that whole societies become built on raiding other societies for enslaved people, creates this cycle of wars. The fact that guns are coming into Africa, because one of the things swapped for slaves on the coast of Africa is guns, creates this world of destabilization in which hundreds of African kingdoms and polities and ethnic groups fight one another over slavery, over access to the slave trade, over defense against the slave raiders. There's attacks on the slave fortresses. So Africa is destabilized. Also, some ethnic groups, some leaderships are enormously enriched. There's huge amounts of money and power made by certain families, certain dynasties. There are African countries right now who are ruled by people whose ancestors were slave traders. So Africa is destabilized by it. And then there's the Caribbean and there's North America, where the enslaved people end up. And those societies are the first societies ever in which slavery is at the center of everything. Not so much North America, but take someone like Barbados. Barbados is the world's first true slave society. Not a society that has slavery, but a society in which everything is built around slavery. To be black is to be enslaved, to be white is to be free. They create a slave code, a law to make sense of this in 1661, which is then copied and sent all over the Caribbean, all over North America. This is a society where the economics are so clear that to take an acre of land and do anything other than grow sugar on it is economically illiterate, because sugar and slavery are so astonishingly powerful. So what you create in those societies are societies in which overwhelmingly large black populations are ruled by tiny white populations, in which ideas of race are absolutely built in to how those societies are governed. And the demographics of those societies, how many people there are, is shaped by the economics of an international sugar business, no connection to the actual topography of the island or the economics of the opportunities of the islands. So the Caribbean has spent the past 170 years trying to escape from the legacies of slavery and the slave trade, actually 190 years. Britain has spent the same time trying to come to terms or even acknowledge the role in which this industry played in its enrichment. And Africa has been shaped in all sorts of ways by the destabilization caused by the slave trade. And remember, the slave trade was a step in a later European penetration of Africa. Even the suppression of the slave trade was a stepping stone to what became in the late 19th century the European conquest of Africa. At the beginning of the 19th century, there were tiny little footholds of European power in Africa. By the end of the 19th century, only 2 African kingdoms were free, were not part of the European empires. So this whole world has been shaped by it. But the other thing to remember is millions of people in America, in the Caribbean, here in Britain, and elsewhere, are the descendants of this history. So this history, like the other histories, is a living history. It is part of the family histories of millions of people here in Britain and all over the world. Another reason why I think this history is emerging into the 21st century is because the voices of the people who are the descendants of the enslaved, that they are demanding that this history no longer be ignored. So it's shaped and continues to shape all of those different parts of the world. But that's a great question. Thank you very much. Quiet for this question, please. Thank you very much.
Were British and French forces segregated like the American forces were during the First and Second World War?
That's a really interesting question. So, British forces. So, there are black British people, then as now, who serve in the British Army in non-segregated ways because they're just British people. There are British people who are living in British cities who volunteer or who are conscripted into the British Army, who've never known another country, who haven't got another nationality, and they serve alongside the other people from the same towns that they're from. It gets more complicated when they seek to become officers. The most famous case is the case of Walter Tull. Walter Tull was a footballer. He was from Folkestone on the south coast, black British. He was brought up in a children's home. And he played for Tottenham Hotspur. He played for, I forgot the name of which Scottish team he played for. And in 1914, he volunteered and went to fight in France on the Western Front. It's only when because he was so good at being a soldier, he was promoted to being an officer, that became an issue, because the army had a covenant that said only people of European descent could be officers. But because this was 1916, because so many people were being killed, the British Army made an exception in the case of Walter Tull. So you do have British soldiers and even British officers fighting in white units, just like anybody else. But then you have the units that come from the colonies. So the British West Indies Regiment, they all fought together, not because they were black, but because they were from the West Indies. They were from the same islands, very often with white officers. The British Army of India was a very special case. It was an army that had been created since the days of the East India Company back in the 18th century. And they had a tradition of white officers who spoke Indian languages, but those units were made up of soldiers from the Indian subcontinent, and they fought as regiments. So there is no sort of strict segregation policy, but there are units that are from specific places. Something similar in the French army. It got completely different when you get to the American army. The American army then, in the First World War and the Second World War, was incredibly segregated. The idea the Americans had was that they wanted black soldiers, but they didn't want them to fight. They didn't want them to come back from the First World War with medals on their chest, with their uniforms, feeling proud, because they didn't want them to come back to America and start demanding the same equal rights as white people. Because America is a country like Britain that respects veterans. People who fought in wars get special treatment, they get special tax breaks, they are respected. And America was very determined that black soldiers didn't fight and didn't get that respect. What happened is there was huge pressure within America that created two regiments of soldiers that did fight, the 369th and 368th. When they came back, they were treated with incredible abuse. Soldiers who'd fought on the Western Front, who'd fought for America, when they got home, the soldiers from the South, there were gangs waiting for them at the train stations that stripped them off their uniforms, that attacked them. One soldier was blinded for coming back, having fought for his country, with his medal on. So huge efforts were made to try to prevent African American soldiers from fighting, and when they did, lynch mobs in the South tried to delegitimize, tried to use force so that they couldn't use the fact that they were veterans to demand better treatment in the South, an end to segregation, an end to lynching. So there was segregation in the American army, not the British and the French, but people fought in different units based on where they were from. Thank you. And there's a question.
This is a question from my older sister, and she was wondering why you accepted an OBE if you disagree with the monarchy.
Well, I don't really disagree with the monarchy. I think it's silly that we have one family who are given a constitutional power. But this is the way our country has decided it's going to honour people. In France, it's called Légion d'honneur. I forgot what the one in Italy that my friend Mary Beard has. That's what this country has decided. And so, when you're a black person, and particularly someone who writes about the empire and the violence of empire, and you're offered an honour that has the word empire in it, you have to think about it. Now, the argument against is that you boycott. You say no as a matter of principle, and you say no as a sort of, as a statement. But the question there is, do boycotts work? Well, the original boycott, comes from an attempt to boycott, to not take part in it's quite complicated, about the Land League in Ireland in the 1880s, and it failed. Many boycotts don't work. And so you can do something symbolically as a gesture, and sometimes it's effective, very often it's not. I think usually it isn't. But then you also have to think about who else has made that same decision. And I look at the people who I admire, who thought it was the right thing to take a British honour. So Doreen Lawrence, the mother of Stephen Lawrence, is Dame of the British Empire, Doreen Lawrence. My friend David Harewood, the actor. There's a long list of Black Britons who I really, really admire, who decided that it was worth it. Because the thing that those honours do is they give you influence. So I run 2 companies. I give people jobs. I make television programs, I make podcasts, I write books, I do journalism, and I hire people. I have to win commissions. I have to persuade people to give me money to make those programs. I have to persuade organizations to let me run programs that are about history, about heritage. And having influence is part of that. I'd much rather have the power to give young black people jobs, to make programs about forgotten bits of history, to use my power and my position and my public profile to bring about change, than to make a gesture that might not achieve anything. And I think if somebody like Doreen Lawrence can make that same equation when her son was murdered by racists, it's a very small thing for me to do the same thing. And also, I know a few people who said no, one of whom has recently passed away, and they actually regretted it, because they regretted the influence that comes with it. But I'm not opposed to the royal family, because the royal family are a family. I just don't think they should have a constitutional role. If that answers the question.
My question is, how can your speech today be applied to real-world situations, i.e. the war in Ukraine and Palestine?
Well, I think history is applied to what's happening in the world today very powerfully. I mean, who's the most important historian in the world today? To me, that's a very easy answer. It's Timothy Snyder. It's the historian who has written some of the most important books about what happened in Eastern Europe in the Second World War. He's an historian of Ukrainian history, but also of the Holocaust and the Second World War. And he's an historian who's written and campaigned more passionately, more effectively, I think, than anybody else about just how vital it is that Ukraine wins that conflict. He's also the historian, and I strongly recommend you go and listen to Timothy Snyder's talks, which are online, his Substack, where he writes and talks about American politics, because I think he's the person who's, more than anybody else, making us think about just how dangerous the politics coming out of America at the moment are. And remember, we are very, very close to an election that will shape the 21st century. So I think historians are at the center of that history. I think in terms of understanding what's happening in the Middle East, history is absolutely vital. One of the big viral hits on the internet of last year were Rory Stewart, the former politician, who's now a podcaster, explaining the history from the Balfour Declaration in the 1920s all the way through to the current war in Gaza. You cannot make sense of what's happening in the Middle East without history. So I think history it's not just relevant to what's happening, it's absolutely fundamental. And it's one of the strange things about the war in Ukraine is that some of the most dangerous things that Putin has written have been his attempts to write history or to rewrite history. His argument that Ukraine is not really a country, that Ukrainian citizenship, Ukrainian sovereignty doesn't really exist, they emerged in a history essay he wrote in 2020 when we were all in lockdown. His kind of charge of false consciousness, which has led to this war, was about his misinterpretation, misrepresentation of history. History has actually been one of the most dangerous ingredients in this development of a kind of messianic form of ethnic fascism that has taken over Russian politics. So I don't think you can understand the moment we're in now without understanding how history is part of it. History has been abused to justify it, and I also don't think you can understand how we got here. The last thing the Trump administration did, I hope the only Trump administration did, was it published the 1776 Commission, which was a response to something called the 1619 Report, which was an attempt, like in Britain, many Americans want the story of slavery to be part of American history. The 1619 Report was an attempt to do that, to show slavery is part of American history, whether you're comfortable with it or not. The response by the Trump administration was the 1776 Report. That report, dismissed and denounced by historians, that made an appeal for what the authors called patriotic education. That's the teaching of history, not so we can think about the past and try to analyze the past and look at documents and try to make our own minds up and think about interpretations. That's a form of history that just tells you your country was always on the right side. Your country was good. The only relationship you could have with your country that's valid is one of pride and patriotism and nationalism. History is fundamental to understanding not just Ukraine and Gaza, but what's happening in America right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, if not for the transatlantic slave trade, the world wars, and the Windrush generation, do you think that people would recognise black history as much as they do today?
I think the reason that we recognise it is because the demographics of the country have changed. 14% of people in the UK now are not whites. They are Asian, Caribbean, African, mixed. By one projection, by 2050, so not that far away, 25 years away, you'll be in your 40s, I guess, by then. This country is going to be around 30% not white. So the country you're going to live in is going to be twice as diverse as the country you're being brought up in. I think it is the sheer reality of the demographics of Britain that's bringing about these changes. And the people who are pushing to reframe our history to be more inclusive, it's not politicians. Very often, it is heritage organisations who have a business model. So if you're the National Trust, or you're English Heritage, or you're somebody who produces lesson plans for schools, or who publishes history books, and if you look at those projections, 2050, almost 1 in 3 people is going to be not white. And remember that 1 in 3, they also have families, you know. Half of my family is white. You might look at them and think they've got no connection to black history, but half of their family is black. There's members of my family who are Indian, and members of my family who are Persian. The ways in which that 1/3 speaks to a much, much bigger diversity, family diversity, means that those organizations who have a business model based on history, they look at the future and they think, if we don't include these stories, which are the family histories of 1 in 3 people, and the broader extended family histories of many more people, we have no audience. You know, if you're not speaking to 1 in 3 people and you're trying to get them to come and look at stately homes or come to art galleries or come to museums or buy your books, you're in real trouble as a business. So I think at a very pragmatic level, there's a desire to re-understand and make history more inclusive because of the demographics of the country. We're just so diverse. Everyone's stories just not just morally, but economically need to be included. So I think that's a big part of it. But I think the other thing is your generation. Your generation seems to have a very different relationship to history than my generation, my parents and my grandparents. You don't seem to look to history and expect history only to tell you that Britain was a wonderful, magical country in the past. Your generation seems to expect that some of history is wonderful and celebratory, and some of it's terrible, and we should not celebrate it, but we should think about it. We should know about it. You seem to understand that disguising the slave trade, disguising sexism, disguising all of these other things in the past, that doesn't get us anywhere. So a lot of the push comes from people looking at your generation and saying, here's a generation who don't want the past only to tell them comforting stories, only to tell them that their country is exceptional in all these sorts of ways. So I think a bigger push factor that's leading to these changes are you guys. Thank you. Do we have another question?
This is a personal question.
Can we have some quiet for this question, please?
This is a personal question, but being black and British, coming from Nigeria, and also having a white mother, did you ever feel like growing up you was insecure or like out of place, or just felt very just outcasted with your ethnicity growing up, especially at the time where it was very prejudice and discriminate?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the 80s were a very racist time in Britain, and most people of my generation have got some bad memories of Britain in the 80s. I think what I felt was that I was very comfortable with being half white working class. My family, and we know our family history. It goes back to Tranent, a town in Scotland. My ancestors were at an event called the Tranent Massacre. So there's a very strong white working class history in my family that I'm very proud of. And my father, parents separated, but my father was still part of my life. My father was very eager that I felt a strong sense of being Yoruba, Nigerian. But I'm also black and British. And that had no legitimacy. That was the identity that people seem to say didn't exist. I mean, we use that phrase now, black and British. When I was growing up, people didn't, because the idea was that to be British, you had to be white. Now, it is still the case, even in 2024, that there are still people in Britain who think you can't be British unless you're white. Now, very few people of your generation think that. It's much, much more older people. But let's take another identity, which is more complicated. Englishness. I wrote a book called Black and British. I think if I wrote a book called Black and English, and remember, I was born in Nigeria, but I've lived in 5 cities, all of them in England. Never lived in Scotland, never lived in Wales, never lived in Northern Ireland. I'm as much English as I am British. If I'd written a book called Black English, I think there would have been a very different reaction to it. Because much fewer, far fewer I should say, black British people feel comfortable calling themselves black English. The interesting thing is, black British people, we have surveys done by an organisation called British Futures, shows this. Black British people feel that they're not allowed to call themselves black English, and yet when people survey white English people, fewer of them have a problem with it than black people imagine. So there's a strong sense among black people that we're not allowed certain identities. In the last census, censuses are where we will have to fill in forms so the government can know about our families and can do some maths about how to run the country. In the last census, you could tick a box saying black British or black Scottish or Welsh or Irish, but there was no box for black and English. So we have all of these complicated identities. And I think for me, as for most people, it's a sort of never-ending conversation. Sometimes I feel very British. Sometimes I feel quite Nigerian. When I go to Nigeria, my family there says, "Oh my God, you're so British. Why don't you like this food? Why can't you speak your language properly?" So it's constantly a negotiation. I feel British, but I feel working class British. My partner's from a very different sort of background, and we're quite different because of different forms of Britishness. I think when I was younger, I thought you had to decide on your identity, like there was going to be an exam, like you had to work it out and come to a decision. And what you realize is you'll always be thinking and debating and negotiating, and your sense of identity will evolve and change because there's no final position to get to. And your relationship with your identity, your relationship with your country will change because, of course, your country will also change. The world of 2050, we mentioned earlier, will be a very different Britain to the one today. If that answers your question.
Hi.
Hi there. Can you have some quiet for the question, please?
So, I want to ask if, is there, a bit in Black history that no one really talks about or, doesn't have enough evidence about, and if that, if you're, working on it or trying to, find more?
Yeah. Well, a great deal of Black history, the great problem is the evidence. It's really, really frustrating, because what we sometimes get is we get these snapshots where we can suddenly see these black communities, and then there's nothing else in the documents. Let me give you an example. In 1772, there was a judgment called the Mansfield Judgment. It's the end of the so-called Somerset case. This is the legal case brought by the abolitionist Granville Sharp to try to determine whether it is legal or illegal to hold someone as an enslaved person in Britain. Quiet, please. This is one of the most important cases of the 18th century. Could you be quiet, please? Sorry. This is one of the critical moments in British history. The debate about whether slavery is legal or illegal has been going on by that point for 15, 20 years. The Somerset case is the moment of decision. And what is decided in the Mansfield judgment in a very complicated and confusing way, and the judgment is more interpreted than given, is that it isn't illegal. It isn't legal for people to be enslaved in Britain. Now, we think there are hundreds, maybe thousands of people who lived in forms of slavery in Britain. We've found 900 advertisements in British newspapers for the sale of enslaved people here in Britain, including in Manchester, or for the return of enslaved people who'd escaped. 900 advertisements. We have estimates of how big this population was that go from 5,000 to 30,000. We don't know. Now, that day of that judgment, black people had gone to court for weeks and weeks to listen to the evidence, knowing that their future, their safety, their status as human beings rested on this judgment. And what we have is we have a single description of a party when the judgment said that slavery was not legal in a pub in London. And it describes this black community. It describes black men and black women dancing, celebrating. Got nothing for the next day, nothing for the previous day, nothing about what happens later, nothing about the consequences of this decision. It's like walking into a room that's dark and flashing a bulb for a second and seeing everybody and then being put back into darkness for a year. So we have these amazing illuminating flashes where we see these people, we can hear their stories, we can feel their humanity, and then back to the darkness. So one of the great frustrations of black history is we have incomplete stories, we have half biographies, we have people we can read about and hear about for a moment, and then we never hear about them again. James Somerset himself, the man after whom this case is emerged, he goes to Granville Sharp's house 2 days later, and we never hear of him again. We don't know whether he lives or dies, whether he stays in Britain, whether he leaves. Nothing. We have these just tantalizing stories. So even the areas where we know most, like the Black Georgians, there's a lot of gaps to be filled. And this is one of the reasons why one of the things I do is I work in fiction and drama. I haven't got the skills to write novels, or else I would, but I work in drama production. So I've just been working as an executive producer on a drama that's going to be on Disney in January. It's called 1,000 Blows. And it is based on the story of exactly one of those black figures, a guy called Hezekiah Moscow. And his story is almost unbelievable. He was a Jamaican. His parents were killed in the Morant Bay Rebellion of 1865. He came to Britain in the 1880s to become a lion tamer. Couldn't find a job as a lion tamer. It's a bit niche. And became a bare-knuckle boxer. He became an incredibly effective, incredibly successful boxer. We have, for a few months, all of these details about him, his life, how he fought, the battles, the fights he wins in the ring, and then silence. We don't know what happens to him. We don't know what happens to his wife. We have no idea. He just disappears from the record. And so Stephen Knight, who made Peaky Blinders, Stephen Knight and his team, including myself, have built this huge drama imagining a life for Hezekiah Moscow. Because sometimes art can fill in the gaps. Art can let us imagine the humanity of people for whom history only gives us a flash. Thank you for the question. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.